Hi everyone, my name is Aliaksandr Herasimenka and I'm a researcher at University of Oxford at the program on democracy and technology, where we study computational misinformation and propaganda. And this research is about platforms that often become targets of misinformation because many people perceive them as under-moderated or under-regulated platforms. I'm looking at the case of Telegram, and this research is been produced by a team of great researchers at our program, including Jonathan Bright, Aleksi Knuutila, Philip Howard, and me. When we discuss social media platform moderation, we might, of course, notice that there are several of them that considered to be major platforms, such as Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, that really focus on content moderation partly because they experience quite a lot of pressure to control their content, to prevent, one of the reasons for that is, of course, to prevent the spread of misinformation. But there are some other social media platforms that seek to distinguish themselves by having relatively little content moderation or other restrictions on user-produced content. And this, as a result, often results in the perception of these under-moderated platforms as places where most harmful distributors of misinformation exist. However, today there is quite little research to measure the scale of misinformation and understand how it spreads on these under-moderated platforms. It's partly because it's quite difficult to compare the circulation of digital journalism, so kind of good professional content, and misinformation across these all myriads, all hundreds of thousands of forms of online content that users distribute. What we try to do is to, in fact, measure the scale of misinformation and understand how it compares and spreads on under-moderated platforms. We looked at the case of Telegram, a messaging platform that I'm gonna discuss in a second, and we asked whether misleading information producers are more successful than professional news producers. You might have noticed that Telegram, which now has more registered users than Twitter, more than 500 million been reported by the owners of Telegram, that this platform, in fact, has grown in popularity following January 2021 events in DC, when many people joined the app, and very often, apparently, this graph comes from a side project, but it shows, compare engagement across different platforms with the same type of content. We've seen a spark in engagement with content shared on Telegram over January days, and actually people or groups that benefited most on Telegram were groups that often spread misleading, misinformation content, just like these examples shown on this picture. So Telegram been growing and has been considered to be quite significant source of misinformation due to the growth of the audience of places where misinformation, political, social misinformation often circulates. And often, of course, it's considered to be and presented as an alternative or under-moderated platform. So it's a great example for our research. What we looked at, of course, is special type of content that circulates across Telegram, and we looked as a unit of analysis, we looked at posts that circulate on Telegram. So as on any other platform, a user can write a post, and it can be shared either on a group, which looks more like a chat or a forum, so more like a standard type of messaging service such as WhatsApp, for instance, or on a channel, something that WhatsApp doesn't have. Channel reminds a Twitter feed without a default opportunity for commenting or reacting to a post. So it's a collection of text, images, and videos that is produced by very often anonymous authors. The key advantage of looking at Telegram is that we can actually learn how many times a post been viewed by other users, something that is not possible in case of Facebook, for instance, case of Twitter, without access to any very specific type of statistics, which is not available to the public. But in case of Telegram, it is available. However, there is no search function. You cannot search across Telegram like you can search across Instagram or Facebook or Twitter, for instance. This complicates things a bit. But we found a solution. We found a way to overcome this, and I'm going to discuss in a second. Before that, I will look at 4 ideas for hypotheses that we produced while reviewing literature that relates to content moderation and misleading information spreading on other platforms, on other major platforms. As I mentioned, Telegram is, of course, under-researched platform, though it becomes very prominent, bigger than Twitter, still under-researched. What we know from other examples, from other studies, is that very often misleading content is viewed and shared more often than professional news sources. And that's what our first 2 hypotheses are about. If posts contain a link to known sources of misleading information, they will attract more Telegram views than posts with links to professional news sources. Similar, the second hypothesis sounds very similar, just we replace views with shares. The third hypothesis is about active content contributors, exactly those people who contribute to spreading of misleading content most often. We suggest that channels sharing links to misleading sources will be more active content contributors than those sharing links to professional news sources. And finally, the last hypothesis suggests that misleading sources are confined to a smaller set of channels than professional news sources. In other words, we might deal with large volumes of misleading content, but it's confined, it's restricted to smaller universes, smaller sets of channels. How we tested those hypotheses? We used an open access data set. It's available to everyone. It contains more than 300 million Telegram messages, both from channels and groups from a long period of time. And we looked at the most recent year-long period available between 2018 and 19. We found more than 6.8 million messages. And then we restricted our review to only channels. Posts appeared in channels, those broadcasting Twitter-like feeds, and we looked at only those posts that contained a link to either professional news source or a misleading source that been linked. We look at lists of those 2 types of sources based on previous studies, most popular types of sources, especially those that circulate around the United States. What we found, of course, a few words, what is a resulting data set. We analyzed it more. It contained more than 200,000 posts. 200,000 posts, each post on average been viewed around 180 times and not really shared very often, as you can see on your screens. So this is descriptive statistics on your screen. So we analyzed essentially about 3% of all posts for the period we initially looked at. What we found? The first hypothesis, as you remember, relates to views, whether misleading content is viewed more often than professional content. What we did, we applied a few statistical tests. We found, in fact, apparently that the hypothesis could not be supported. Apparently, posts linking to misleading information get fewer views than posts linking to professional news sources. The second hypothesis sounds very similar, but it was not about views, but about shares. What we found is that posts to misleading sources are in fact more likely to be shared to other Telegram channels. So the second hypothesis was supported. The third hypothesis was about channels that spread misleading sources. We found that they were on average 18% more active content contributors than other channels. And this we analyzed based on reach, which was defined as the number of views per subscriber to a channel. So as the proportion of misleading sources in a channel goes up, so does the activity level of the channel. So this third hypothesis being supported as well. Finally, the last one looked at professional news sources and misleading sources from the perspective of where those two types of content appear. What we found that professional news sources appeared in approximately 3 times as many channels as misleading sources, which means that the last hypothesis been also supported. What does it tell us about the nature of misleading content on under-moderated platforms? What the study shows, in fact, is that not all under-moderated platforms had become those toxic environments where misleading information circulates, as they often portrayed it in media and public discussion, public discourse often. We demonstrate that links to known sources of misleading information are shared more often than links to professional news sources. But at the same time, they are viewed less often, right? So it's interesting combination of different approaches. But at the same time, when it comes to audiences, the audiences of misleading sources on those under-moderated platforms, and when it comes to Telegram specifically, might be typically smaller than those audiences that are more engaged. And contrary to received wisdom, the audience for misinformation is not a general one, but a small, but at the same time active one. There's active communities of users. This brings us to the last point. I think it's important to emphasize that moderation is one of the key solutions, obviously, to the problem of misinformation, political misinformation in particular. However, it's difficult to discuss it as a separate strategy. When it comes to platforms where little moderation is present, misinformation still does not dominate, even though there are little sort of structural restrictions on the spread. There might be other reasons for that relates to the nature of a platform, affordances, how virality emerges. And that might be actually provide one of the key to the answers to the problem of misinformation. The answer might relate not to the restrictions that are imposed from above, from platform owners, but rather the solution might be linked to the tweaks and changes to the algorithms, to the model how platforms make money, because in fact Telegram is a non-profit platform, at least doesn't bring much profit to the owners, as we know, and it relates to virality of algorithms on Telegram. Perhaps by changing our attitude towards algorithms on platform, we might address the problem of misinformation. Thank you a lot for your attention, and hope to see you next year in person.